Hi, my name's Stewart Lynch, and in this video, as part of the Swift Deeper Understanding series, I want to take a closer look at initializers. We'll take a look at what an initializer is for structs and classes, and we'll look at creating multiple initializers for a struct or class, and we'll find out what a convenience initializer is. And then we'll finish this video by looking at how we can create a custom initializer for a SwiftUI HStack. I love getting your feedback, so tap the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video and leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to the video and ring that bell to get notifications of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. I have a two-part series on initializers that takes a different approach to what I'm going to do in this video, so I encourage you to take a look at them to get a more rounded explanation. I'll leave the links in the description. I hope that this video will clear up some things for you as it did for me as I created it. I have a starter playground set of pages that I created for this video, and I encourage you to download it from the link in the description and work along with me. Once completed, you'll have something that you can refer back to in the future. Now, if you're not seeing this rendered markup, be sure you set the option from the editor menu as described here. It'll make navigation between pages much easier. So let's get started. Consider this person model as the first example. It's created as a struct. In Swift, when you create an instance of a struct, you initialize it. And structs have something that is called a member-wise initializer. And a member-wise initializer in Swift is a special kind of initializer that's automatically generated for structs by the Swift compiler. And this initializer takes a set of parameters that match the properties of the struct and uses them to initialize the struct's properties. Well, when we create an instance of the person object, the only requirements are the name and age. In Xcode, the properties that do not require a value are grayed out. And the reason is that both name and age don't have any values assigned to them, so when we create a new instance, we need to provide a value. Well, num_children doesn't have a value either, but it's optional, and optional properties default to nil. Married, on the other hand, is a Boolean property, and it does have a value assigned, so all people created with the default initializer will not be married, and the value of num_children will be set to nil. Now, nil is different from 0, though in this case it's essentially the same thing. Now, if we want to create a person who has children and is married, we need to provide values for all four properties. We can quickly get to that when we create a new property of person if we want to access all non-required values by holding down the Option key on the keyboard to make them visible. And now when I tap Enter, I can provide values for all four arguments. In this next case then, I want to accept the default value for married being false, but I want to be able to specify the number of children. Well, you can accept the default and enter the two values, but after age, we can manually add num_children and provide a value. Now the downside here is that you have to remember what those labels are. In later versions of Xcode, this has been simplified because when you start to create a new instance, you can start typing labels until they get highlighted, and then move on to the next one that you want until all of the ones you require are highlighted. For example then, I can start creating a new person object, and then I can type in NAM, and then because the first letter of our next label is an A, it's not in our first label of name, I can type A and age starts to get highlighted. And then the next property that I want is married. Well, its first letter starts with an M, and there's no conflict here. I can simply type in an M, and married becomes highlighted. Now I can hit Enter and start provide values for those three arguments. Let me copy the struct from the first example and paste it into this second example. I'm going to change a struct to a class. This gives me an error stating that person has no initializers. And this means we need to create our own member-wise initializer. Now in Xcode now, in a non-playground, in a real project, this will be completed for us automatically. but it's good to create it manually here so that you understand what's required. An initializer is a special method that is used to create a new instance of a class and to set the initial values of the properties. And initializers are called when a new instance of a type is created, and they ensure that the instance is properly initialized before it can be used. So creating an initializer is like creating a function, but without the func keyword. It's just init, and then within the parentheses, you're required to provide the parameters that don't have default values or are non-optional, which in our case is name and age. And then we can simply assign the name and age properties from our parameters to the properties of the class itself properties. Now when we start to create our person, we see that there are no grayed out options. I can only choose that single person providing a name and an age. Now if I want to create a person who has children and is married, we can start by creating that default person, including the name and age, but as I see here, there's no way that the initializer will allow us to add a number of children and married status here. If we tried adding number of children, there's no option for me, as there was in our struct. So I have to add those values in after the object has been created. Now, if you want some flexibility in creating a class instance as you get with structs, then you can provide the optional and non-assigned values as your function parameters. So let's copy the class from the previous example, and let's add in the additional parameters to our init method. And that would be numChildren, which is an optional int, so it should be default to nil. So you would think that you could just leave it like this to replicate the struct. And for married, it's Boolean, but we do need to give it a default value of false. And then in the body, you can assign the parameter values to the corresponding self properties. Now when you create instances of this class object, I see the new initializer, but only the married property is in gray. The numChildren property is now a default that will be added as an argument when we create the instance. We'll actually have to specify that it is nil or has a number. If we want to replicate the behavior of our struct, we must, in the initializer parameter, specify that the optional int property is nil by default. Now when we try to create an instance, I see that both numChildren and married are not required. But if I want to include one of them, I can use that shorthand method by typing in matching characters until the properties are highlighted, like using NAMAM to skip the numChildren, and then I can hit enter and provide values for those arguments. Let's move on now then to the next page of multiple initializers. Going back to our original struct, we know it has a memberwise initializer, but I don't like the fact that there is only one initializer for this struct. I'd really like to be able to choose from one of a number of different initializers to give me the same thing. Like I see when I'm creating an instance of a button, for example, in SwiftUI. It has many options. So in our first example then, on this page, where we have that person struct once again, let's create an initializer that will allow me to enter a name and an age and the married status from an initializer without having to do the magic typing thing. So we'll create the initializer like this, and I'll add in the parameters for married in here as well as the name and age. And it will allow me to override the default false value for married when I choose this. Then, as always in the body, we assign those parameters to the properties of self. When we try to create a person now, though, we only see that we have this single initializer. We've lost our memberwise one. So it's worthwhile to note that when you create a custom initializer for a struct, you lose the memberwise one. so you'll need to create it if you want it. So let's create then initializers that's going to cover all 4 of our cases. I'll just copy that previous initializer and add in the 2 other properties with an optional int for num children and a Boolean type for married, but not add a default value. I'll have to make sure again that the body is updated. And now I can create a person with all 4 of those values. Let's move on now and copy that previous example and create a new initializer that'll give me the option to create a person that's going to require a name and age only and accept the default values of nil for children and false for marital status. So what I can just do then is remove those last parameters and then the assignments in the body. Now, as you see, when I create a new person object, I have 3 initializers to choose from, and I can choose the one that just requires a name and age. Next up, let's create one that will allow us to create a person and specify the number of children on initialization, but default the marriage status to false. So again, I'm going to copy example 2 and use it, and I'll simply remove the married parameter. Now, as you see, there are 4 initializers, and I can choose which one I want. Well, what I don't see, though, is that original struct memberwise initializer that has the 2 grayed out options. It would be nice to see it as well. So to do this, again, we'll start with the example initializer that has all 4 parameters, but not provide a default value for num children and leave it at nil, and I'll assign false to married. When we do this, though, we get an error for our second person because the initializer is ambiguous. There are more than 1 initializers that have the same argument types and labels. Well, we can solve this problem by changing one of our label names. Or better yet, I'll just place an underscore in front of the first name label. This means when we create an instance of this object, we don't have to specify a label, and that makes this initializer unique. So now I have a choice of choosing from 5 different initializers. And then finally, for this last example, I want to create an array of 4 person using different initializers. Well, let me call that array family, and it'll be of type of array person. And then I'll set up an empty array. So I'll start with a standard person object and choose from my selection of initializers. So let me just choose the one that requires the name, age, and num children, and I'll provide values. For the next object of this array, I'm going to do something a little different. The person struct has a method that is an initializer. So in our array, we know that we need to create a person type, so I can simply use shorthand and type a period to display all methods of that type, which is the init. So there are a number of them from which I can choose. So I can use this then to create my remaining person objects for this array. And each time I'm going to select a different initializer each time. Now we're in a playground and we're never using this family property, so if you don't like to see this warning here, you can simply replace the family designation label here with an underscore. On the next page here, let's consider the struct that has a memberwise initializer. It's different from the previous example in that there's no optionals and no default values assigned. I want to have 2 initializers. One that will allow me to enter all 3 values, and a second one that will default to the value of married being true. First, let's create a member-wise initializer, because by creating a second initializer, I know I'm going to lose this one. And the member-wise initializer is referred to as the primary or the designated initializer. So we'll need to provide name, age, and married as properties for our initializer, and then in the body we'll assign those property values to the self properties. Now for our specific case where we want to fix the married status to be true. Well, what we'll do is create an initializer here where we can specify as parameters only those two properties that we require to be provided, namely name and age. Then in the body of the initializer, we can call the member-wise initializer using the self.init, and then assign the name and age values from our initializer. But for married, we give it a specific value, which in our case will be true. Now this is typically called a convenience initializer, where we specify a particular value or values that are most common for our API. We can create an instance then and choose that second initializer. And then if we print out this person's married status, we'll see that it is indeed true. For the second example, let's copy the struct and the initializers, but change the struct to a class. As soon as we do that, however, we get an error saying that the designated or primary initializer cannot delegate with self.init. Did you mean this to be a convenience initializer? Well, I guess I do, so I'm going to let Xcode fix it for me, and it simply inserts the convenience keyword. So let's try and create a person here for this class, and I see that I have two initializers as I had before. But the problem I have with multiple initializers is that I have no idea, in this case, what that second convenience initializer's married status will be. It's not clear at all to me. And if I'm creating an API, or if I'm coming back to this code later, I'd like to know at the call site what these default convenient values are. So what I can do is add quick help to this initializer. So let's remove this first. And then on the line preceding the convenience initializer, I can add 3 forward slashes instead of the 2 for a comment, and then add my comment such as person who is married. Now when I create my instance and I highlight that convenience initializer, I can see it's clear to me here in the creation that this is a person who is married. If you understand initializers, you can start to get a better understanding of how Xcode's documentation works. In another video in this series, I show you trailing closure syntax, and when we looked at the buttons, we saw that they have several different initializers. If you followed this video, perhaps you will see now how these initializers were created and how we can add additional ones. Better yet, let's take a look at Xcode's documentation for an HStack. So there's a second sample project in the resources provided, and it's an iOS app that's called ZeroHStack. It's a simple project where the content view contains an HStack with 2 views, a circle with a frame set to a width of 150, and a rectangle with a frame set to a width and height of 250, along with some padding to set it away from the outer edges. This HStack has some default spacing between the 2 views, but what is that default spacing? So let's check out the documentation for HStack by option-clicking on the HStack to bring up the quick help, and then we can open up the developer documentation by clicking on this link. Now if you scroll down to the creating an HStack, you'll see its initializer, and it has an alignment, a spacing, and content parameters. If we click on the init, we drill down to the initializer itself, and here we see that the default designated initializer for an HStack has a vertical alignment that is center, which we see, but the spacing is set to an optional CG float and nil. Now, this doesn't mean 0, as you can see that this means that there is some default spacing that the HStack applies, and apparently that depends on the platform. It would be really nice if we knew that, but I get all sorts of different answers. And then the content is the views that get presented, and in my case too. So since spacing is an optional value, it's not required in the initializer. But we do know that we can add it in, so let's choose 10, because that's what I heard the default was, and nothing should change in my view. But it does. Turns out that 10 isn't correct. And as you see, when I add and remove it, the spacing changes. If I change it to 8 though, it looks like that's what it is. So at least in this case, for this device, it's an HStack with a spacing of 8. And if I wanted to have no space at all, I could set it to 0. But I want this to be the default for all of my apps without having to specify and give that spacing argument. So what I need is another initializer. However, since I don't own the HStack's definition, I can't modify it, but I can create an extension for an HStack and create an additional initializer in the extension. Now, if you're interested in learning more about extensions, please watch another video in this series where I'll go into extensions in more detail. But let's return to the documentation for that HStack, and I'm going to copy the default initializer and modify it for my extension. So I'll return to Xcode and create the extension for our HStack. I'm going to do that outside of the current struct, just in this current file. But normally I'd create another file for this. Now I can paste in that new initializer, but I'm going to change the spacing from nil to 0 and the CG float to be not an optional value. This means then we won't be required to enter a spacing argument, and it should default to 0. We're told that our initializer requires a body. So this is just a closure, so we'll add a pair of braces for that body. We're told then that the self.init isn't called in all paths before returning. So we'll do that simply by calling the original initializer and assign our alignment and spacing to the corresponding ones. And then since content is a closure, we can simply hit enter to set it up for our content. Well, this content will be the same as the content that's passed in, but we need to make sure that we annotate the content in our initializer parameter as being a view builder. Then we can simply use the content as the content in the body of our initializer. We do get another error, however, specifying that the converting a non-escaping value to this may allow it to escape. And we can let Xcode fix this. It simply inserts a pair of parentheses. Now there are no errors, but we get this warning that this function call, which is the initializer, causes an infinite recursion. Why? Well, we've seen this before, because our initializer has exactly the same labels as the original. So we can change the spacing label to be something like 0 spacing in the extension initializer, and then assign that to the original HStack initializer's spacing label. As soon as you do that, you'll find that your spacing has changed on your HStack to 0 without having to adjust anything at the call site. But we could add spacing if we wanted to. We could go back to the start and add a new argument to our HStack, and we see that we have two different initializers, one with spacing and one with 0 spacing. I could choose either, so let me just choose the common one that we're used to for spacing and add in my custom spacing. So in this case, it's using the original default designated initializer. So there you have it. We've replaced the default HStack implementation to have a 0 spacing. Yet we can use the original initializer to use the label spacing to add a custom override spacing. Now this may seem pretty strange because the HStack initializer that is now being used as the default is my custom one. So it would appear that the compiler will first check the existing module for any initializers, and it will override any of the original ones. Well, I hope this tutorial has given you a better understanding of how initializers work in Swift and SwiftUI, and I hope you'll be able to use what you've learned when developing your own applications. This video is in a series of understanding concepts in Swift and SwiftUI, so make sure you check out the playlist for more tutorials that might help you in your learning path. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and leave me a comment. And make sure you subscribe to my channel and ring the bell to get notified of all new videos. Thanks for watching.